This week on Brian Ross Investigates, not again, a new COVID-19 variant sweeps the world and seems poised to sweep across America.
Cases are being reported all over the world now, including among fully vaccinated people.
But is it as scary as first described when it showed up in South Africa? Dr. William Schaffner is here to give us the straight scoop. Plus, The Big Cheat, a new book on Donald Trump and his never-ending efforts to pad his bank account.
Unlike all his 44 successors, Donald Trump walked into the White House trying to do everything he could to enrich himself and his family.
Just how far did the president go?
There was a photo op, and Donald Trump charged $3.15 for each of the glasses of water that were put on the table as props.
Plus, this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the choices made by the editors of Mediaite. From the Law and Crime Trial Network, this is Brian Ross Investigates. Good evening, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to our friends on Facebook Live. I'm Brian Ross, joined as always by my colleague Rhonda Schwartz. And Rhonda, we begin with the Frankenstein Monster that wasn't. The dire warnings about that new COVID-19 variant, the Omicron variant, that tanked the stock market and led to a near panic by some over a killer variant that couldn't be stopped, Rhonda.
Well, now, Brian, real reporting has replaced the speculation, and we've learned the Pfizer vaccine plus a booster seems effective against this new variant, which is spreading more rapidly, but early reports indicate the effects are much less severe, Brian.
So to get a reality check on all this, we're joined now by Dr. William Schaffner from Vanderbilt University's Medical School and one of the country's leading experts on infections. Thank you so much, Dr. Schaffner, for being here. Let me start by asking you, how do you categorize this new variant? We've been told it's so scary.
Well, Brian and Rhonda, good to be with you. You know, I don't certainly characterize it as a Frankenstein variant. My fingers are crossed. We've learned certain things. Number one, the pieces of the puzzle are coming together. Yes, it is highly, highly contagious, probably more contagious than our well-known enemy, the Delta variant. But number two, could it produce less severe disease? There are hints in that direction, but more data will be forthcoming. It certainly doesn't look as though it's producing more severe disease. And then, apropos of what Rhonda has just told us, yes, the early data do look as though our current vaccines, particularly with a booster, really do provide noteworthy protection against Omicron. So far, not too bad.
But Dr. Schaffner, the people at Pfizer are saying there may have to be a fourth shot, another booster. Is that accurate?
Well, you know, the Pfizer folks are looking down the road. We're not anywhere near that yet, but none of us would be surprised if at some interval, let's say annually, as we do with our flu shots, we would have to get a COVID booster along with it. And as a matter of fact, there are now vaccine specialists, those scientists, putting together flu vaccine and COVID vaccine. So maybe we'll only have to roll up one sleeve and get protected annually against both flu and COVID.
Dr. Schaffner, a question for you from Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda?
Is this ever going to end, Dr. Schaffner, or is this our new normal? Are we going to be wearing masks and dealing with variants is there going to be an end?
Rhonda, I wish I could give you good news, but the reality is that COVID is now here with us in one form or another, and we'll be coping with it for the indefinite future, just as we do with influenza. The trick is to do so effectively, to keep the impact of COVID down. For that, we'll all have to cooperate, getting vaccinated periodically, I would imagine, and on occasion, dusting off our masks and putting them on again. That's not so hard if we could all do this together.
Well, that's a good question, Doctor. If we can all do this together, to what extent do you think the resistance, the hesitancy to get vaccinated, the anti-vax movement, the anti-mask movement has hurt the efforts to stop this pandemic?
Well, Brian, as you know, I'm down here in Tennessee. We're a substantially under-vaccinated state, and our state legislature has just passed a series of laws that make public health more difficult. I think the under-vaccinated folks out there, the folks who still haven't availed themselves of the first dose, they really have hampered the public health response to COVID. We keep having to work to try to persuade them to join the rest of us and get vaccinated.
But is persuasion enough? Do you think the mandate should be expanded?
You know, you and I have discussed this before. Yes, I'm actually in favor of mandates. If we're in a war against this virus, we've to date depended on a volunteer army, the people who volunteered to be vaccinated. But the enemy has just gotten reinforced with Delta and now with Omicron. And Uncle Sam now needs you. We're going to draft you into the army. We're going to oblige you to be vaccinated. I don't think that's a bad thing. We've done it in history in the past. And I think mandates will work to bring people in, which is not to say they're easy. As you know, they're hung up in the courts now. But I think it is the best way to getting this virus under control.
Dr. Schaffner, there's been no real evidence of serious side effects, but is there a cumulative effect that could be, for all these boosters, a cumulative effect that we could suffer from having all these different vaccines?
The short answer is no. You know, we get our tetanus boosters every year. We get flu shots every year. We get other vaccines periodically. There really are no long-term adverse effects to these kinds of immunizations. We wouldn't recommend them. The World Health Organization wouldn't recommend them unless the world scientific community had agreed that they were safe.
And let me ask you finally, how are you going to spend the holidays, and what are your recommendations for our viewers about the holidays, given this new variant that's spreading so rapidly?
Well, we have an extended family right here in Nashville. We will all get together. We're all vaccinated and boosted. I would say that that should be a requirement for everyone. And then at Thanksgiving, because we have a couple of family members who are really at high risk of complications, we all got a rapid test that morning. We were all negative. So when we gathered together, we could take off our masks and relax and really enjoy the occasion. And I wish for everyone a safe holiday season.
All right, Dr. William Schaffner from Vanderbilt University, thank you so much for joining us here this evening.
Always a pleasure.
Coming up next, The Big Cheat. A Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist totals up the for-profit presidency of Donald Trump. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law and Crime Trial Network.
Hi, this is Dan Abrams with exciting news for all of our Law and Crime followers on YouTube. You can now get the live Law and Crime Network with YouTubeTV for all of your daily live trial coverage, legal news, expert analysis, and original true crime programs. Subscribe to YouTubeTV today and then locate Law and Crime in the channel guide. And for only $1.99 a month, you can add the network to your bundle. Watch Law and Crime every day with YouTubeTV. We put you in the jury box.
It's now more than a year since Donald Trump lost the election, despite his falsehoods to the contrary. And at the time, we heard a lot about what crimes he was going to be charged with and prospects of the former president being sent to prison. Rhonda?
That's right, yet none of this has happened, Brian, and Mr. Trump continues to exert his influence over the Republican Party, vowing revenge on those in the GOP who voted to impeach him and refused to support the crackpot theories that he and his cadre of loyalists were pushing, Brian.
To get a better understanding of what's happening in the world of Donald Trump, we're joined now by David K. Johnston, the Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter and author of a new book, The Big Cheat: How Donald Trump Fleeced America and Enriched Himself and His Family. David, thanks so much for joining us. How did he fleece America?
Well, unlike all his 44 successors, Donald Trump walked into the White House trying to do everything he could to enrich himself and his family, not just while he was in office, although he intended to stay forever, but in the event he wasn't in office afterward. And we have, what I've done in this book is taken all these loose threads, you know, it's a story in the Wall Street Journal, something in the Washington Post, something at Politico, and picked out things that show you the pattern of what was going on by weaving these loose threads into a tapestry.
And he now face criminal prosecution. Lots of talk about that in the last year or so since he lost the job, but so far no prosecution.
No, but I'm confident he's going to be indicted in Manhattan, among other jurisdictions. What happened in Manhattan is Donald fought to the Supreme Court twice to withhold business records and lost, of course. When the records were turned over, it turned out there wasn't 1 million pages, there were 5 million pages. And the prosecutors have to diligently go through all of those so they aren't hit with a surprise at trial.
As we've seen during the course of his term in office, foreign policy, domestic policy often seem to be intertwined with his own family's financial interests. Is that really what happened?
Exactly what happened, Brian. And one of the most important examples of that was Jared Kushner, the first son-in-law, made a disastrous purchase of a building, 666 Fifth Avenue, just down the street from Trump Tower. He paid $1.8 billion, nearly all of it borrowed, and within a couple of years, it was worth less than half that. So he went to the government of Qatar and tried to get an $800 million loan. And Qatar is home to our most important military base in the Middle East. They are a very crucial ally of us. The Qataris looked at it and said, we're not going to do that. We're not stupid. Donald Trump, as president, then turned on the Qataris. He called them horrible names. He said they were financing terrorists, and he aligned himself with the Saudis and the Emiratis, who are enemies of the Qataris. And it's true that the Qataris fund terrorists, 2 terrorist organizations, according to our State Department, while the Saudis fund about 60. So later, Jared got bailed out by people from Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. And it's in one of a number of stories of where our national security and our national well-being were submarined by the Trump White House for money.
And can you actually show in your reporting, David, that this was cause effect, or is it just a grand coincidence?
It would be kind to call it a grand coincidence. I mean, there's no logical explanation for it otherwise. Plus, the news just broke last week that Jared Kushner, now out of the White House, is using his connections in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates to raise money for him to manage and invest. So I think the fact pattern is overwhelmingly clear as to what took place. The motive in the case of Donald Trump is he doesn't know anything about the Middle East. He doesn't know a Sunni from a Shia. Now, I don't expect most of the people in the audience to know that, but if you're the president of the United States, you damn well better be very sophisticated about divisions within the Middle East.
After he left office, was he wealthier or poorer than when he became president?
Well, to be honest, we don't really know because as we learned from the indictment of the Trump Organization for tax fraud, they keep 2 sets of books. Donald is not a billionaire, but he's not a poor man. He's clearly a wealthy man. He's just not a billionaire.
Yet in your book, you describe example after example of sort of like, which seems to be kind of penny pitching, asking the government to pay for small things.
Yes. Donald did everything he could to get the Secret Service and others to pay the highest prices possible. When Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, came to see him at Mar-a-Lago, there was a photo op, and Donald Trump charged $3.15 for each of the glasses of water that were put on the table as props. I have the invoice showing how thoroughly he made sure not one penny that could be obtained was let go.
He charged for $3.15 for each glass. Literally took the time
water.
to do that.
Yeah, yes, that shows you how diligent Trump told his staff to be.
So if he's billing the government for $3.15 for a drinking glass, what does that say to you about his overall wealth? That's not what a fabulously rich man does, is it?
Well, you know, back in 1990, I revealed Donald wasn't a billionaire. He couldn't pay his vendors. And when he told me he was worth $3 billion as we were walking along in Atlantic City, I said, I don't believe you. He said, what do you mean you don't believe me? Yeah, what's the name of your editor? And I said, well, let me give you his phone number. And, you know, the conversation went to, why don't you believe me? And I said, Donald, I'm a newspaper reporter with 8 children and I pay all my bills on time. you claim to be worth $3 billion and you can't pay your bills.
David, you've been following Donald Trump now for well over a decade, several decades. Has it become an obsession with you?
No, in fact, I had plans to do something entirely different. I was writing a very slim book laying out how we could have a much better federal tax system, a system that every expert who's looked at it says would work. When Donald announced, and I realized he was serious this time, he'd announced before twice. And I felt, knowing Donald as well as I have for more than 30 years, I had a duty to my country to tell people about who Donald Trump is. A lot of other people have said, nobody knows and understands Donald Trump and his finances more than I do. And so all of this has been for me a sense of duty. Trust me, I really had other things I planned to do since I'm past retirement age.
What was the last time you heard from Donald Trump, and what do you expect to hear from him in the future?
Donald, has called me so many times at home, I have no memory of the number. The last time he called me was in April of 2016, when I had asked him to respond to 21 questions about his associations with criminals of various kinds in different venues. And he called to once again yell at me and threaten me and say he was going to sue me, as he's done many times. And I said, well, Donald, if you have a case, sue me. And he angrily hung up on that conversation. And I remember turning to one of my grown children who was sitting in the room and saying, I'll bet that's the last time Donald ever speaks to me.
And it was.
It was. He's referenced me since then a couple of times. He's called me the journalist he hates most in the world, principally, I believe, because he knows I have my stuff down solid and he can't do anything but yell. He has no case against me. And, he has a name for me. He calls me the Weird Dude. So I took out the website weirddude.net, though I haven't done anything with it yet.
All right, the Weird Dude. Thank you so much, David K. Johnston, author of this new book, The Big Cheat, How Donald Trump Fleeced America and Enriched Himself and His Family. David, thank you so much for being with us here tonight.
Thank you, Brian.
Coming up next, this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the choices made by the editors of Mediaite. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law and Crime Trial Network. Time now for this week's winners and losers in the media, as chosen by the editors of Mediaite. And we're joined by Aidan McLaughlin, who's the editor-in-chief of Mediaite, which, like the Law and Crime Trial Network, is part of the Dan Abrams media empire. And Aidan, we begin with your first winner, Yamiche Alcindor, a young woman, a reporter on the rise.
That's right. So Yamiche Alcindor is PBS's Washington correspondent, and she just got snapped up by NBC News to serve as their Washington correspondent. And, it's part of a big spree of hiring that NBC News has been embarking on. I'm sure you've noticed over the last couple of weeks, they've announced a series of big name hires from other outlets. They hired Politico's Mark Caputo, who had been there for a decade. They also hired Tom Yamas from ABC News. So Yamiche is just the latest in this series of hires, which is all set towards NBC News bolstering their streaming platforms. They announced earlier this year that they were going to hire more than 200 journalists to work on those platforms as all the networks sort of make this pivot towards streaming. Yamiche is one of the biggest hires they've made yet. She really made a name for herself in the White House briefing rooms throughout the Trump presidency and now in Joe Biden's administration as well. So it was a big win for NBC News and Yamiche Alcindor.
So the big future for her then.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think, at NBC, that's a bigger platform than PBS. So I expect her to get a lot more face time now, both in the White House and obviously on cable news and on NBC's streaming platform.
And for this week's loser, Chris Cuomo, formerly of CNN.
Yeah, Chris Cuomo, as you know, Brian, has not been having a great couple weeks. He was fired by CNN last weekend. Got called up by Jeff Zucker, who had previously been a staunch defender of Chris Cuomo throughout his problems with his relationship with his brother, and fired him on Saturday afternoon. That became public on Saturday night. Then Harper's, which was publishing his book, announced that they were dropping it. So it was a double punch for Chris Cuomo in the last couple of days. He also announced that he was not doing his Sirius XM show anymore. So right now he doesn't really have any other outlets to speak out on except for his Twitter account, which is really, typically when an anchor or a host gets fired from their cable news show, they'll go to Sirius XM and keep that up, or they'll go to other outlets, maybe host a podcast, have a Substack, something like that, just to keep up an audience. But Chris Cuomo is now without one. So we'll see what happens in the next couple of weeks, whether he reemerges in some capacity. But right now, it seems like what he's going to be doing is pursuing a pretty intense legal fight with CNN, which said that they did not pay him severance after he was fired.
He's looking at $6 million a year, according to reports, and he has 3 years or more left on his contract. So that's a big number. That'll be a big legal fight. He's alleged, essentially, that Jeff Zucker, the head of CNN, knew all along what he was doing.
Right. So he says that Jeff Zucker knew all along that he was advising his brother. And he did disclose over the summer that he was not an advisor, he said, to his brother, but that he would always give his brother advice. Right. That was the sort of language that he used. But we saw when the New York State Attorney General released their report, their massive report into the allegations against Andrew Cuomo, the former governor of New York, that Chris Cuomo really had an almost official level of advice that he was giving. He was texting with Andrew Cuomo's team. He was using his journalistic sources to find out information about when these allegations were being published by news outlets. He really had a very formal role in advising his brother. He was really working with the team, not just advising his brother in sort of a personal capacity. So I think that's what really took Jeff Zucker by surprise. And CNN's obviously going to argue that they fired him for cause and that he's not owed any severance. But as you say, 3 years left on the contract. Chris Cuomo, we expect, was going to be suing for $18 million. He's hired some very high-profile lawyers to fight his case. CNN's going to be doing the same. So things could get pretty ugly now in the next couple months.
Indeed, and as you know, Aidan, Chris Cuomo was a former colleague of mine when I was at ABC News, and I have been filling in for him on Sirius Radio as well. So thank you so much for your reporting again this week from Mediaite. Appreciate it very, very much. And thanks to all of you for joining us, and thanks to our staff here for getting us on the air and off the air every week.